Did you watch the Rolex 24 at Daytona? If you did, then you know all about the incredible racing that took place, the battle that went down to the final minutes of the race, and unfortunately how the white flag was waved a lap early. There sure was a lot that we learned, but let's talk about 5 key things we learned from this year's Rolex 24. The Rolex 24 at Daytona is the crown jewel of the IMSA season. Unlike many other sports who have their biggest events at the very end of the season, IMSA is the opposite, with the longest and most prestigious race happening first. Let's kick things off with GTP and how they picked up right where they left off at the end of the 2023 season. Last year's championship winner, the number 31 Action Express Racing Cadillac, well, they once again found themselves right in the hunt for the win here at Daytona. A late full course yellow and a perfect pit stop executed by Penske ultimately led to them coming up just one spot short on the podium, but still an incredible showing nonetheless. Looking back on it, had that final full course yellow not happened, or the number 7 not executed an absolutely flawless pit stop, and we're probably talking about the 31 winning the Rolex 24 after winning the IMSA championship last year. Porsche was picking things up right where they left off as well. The number 7 looked incredibly strong in this race, but actually both of those Penske Porsches looked strong. Both of those cars were in the hunt during the final hours of this race, and I touched on it just a moment ago about that perfect final pit stop for the 7. I mean, the crew did an incredible job the entire race to keep those cars in the hunt. Porsche also brought a slew of updates to that car, largely focusing on addressing the reliability issues that they had last year. And address them they did after the Rolex 24, and recently after the World Endurance Championship opener. It looks like Porsche has many of those reliability concerns that they had last year largely ironed out. I mentioned it in a recent video, but in order for Porsche to truly pick up where they left off last year, I think they need to start to find some improvements on some of the rougher, the bumpier tracks that we see on the IMSA calendar. Next round out at Sebring is going to be a prime opportunity to showcase that. In terms of the other GTP manufacturers and how they picked up though, Acura did have a relatively okay Rolex 24. They looked really strong in the first half of this race before they experienced some reliability issues. However, looking ahead to Sebring for them, I really think that they can jump back into this GTP fight that they were embedded in for all of last season. They had a strong showing at Sebring last year, and with Wayne Taylor Racing now having 2 cars under their banner, I think that that's only going to make them better as the season goes on. BMW, they're certainly closer than they were last year, but I still think that they're a step behind. Perhaps this car just doesn't suit Daytona very well, but regardless, they look a bit on the back foot. They made large improvements heading into Sebring last year. Let's see if they can continue to improve on that car and jump up into the GTP championship fight. Yeah, GTD Pro at the Rolex 24 was a war of attrition out there. There were also so many new cars entered in the class, 4 brand new full season entries to be exact, and put everyone together and it all made for a 13 car grid for the Rolex. It was surprising to see that so many cars DNF'd, 5 cars DNF'd out of the GTD Pro class, and on top of that, everyone from 4th place onwards was at least 5 laps down. This is a little bit uncharacteristic for the class that has seen such close racing since its inception in 2022. Now perhaps I just didn't think it through in my head that we'd have so many reliability issues as a result of having so many of these brand new cars featured in this race. But on the other side, many of these new cars have undergone so much testing that I didn't think that reliability issues would be as big of a concern for these manufacturers. It's also interesting to see how these reliability issues affected so many established teams on the IMSA grid. We're talking about championship teams like Pfaff, Vassar, Sullivan, and of course Corvette Racing by Pratt Miller. They all experienced significant reliability issues in this race and were down in the running results at the end of it. Now I truly expect some of these reliability concerns will go away as the season goes on, and many of these teams will return to the sharp end of the grid. However, it could be interesting to see how these teams approach Sebring, if they go for a more conservative approach to make sure that they lock down some solid championship points in round 2, because really the last thing that you want to have happen to start your season is a couple of poor results. It can be difficult to stay on top of all of the news from the world of IMSA, That's why I have yet another way for you to stay in the loop. The S's is a weekly email newsletter curated by me with all of the biggest IMSA news and analysis that you need to know. I bring together the best articles from the week, videos, and just general IMSA news that you need to know. In addition to the news, I'll give you my thoughts on everything that's going around in the world of IMSA and what I think you can expect in the upcoming races. You can subscribe to the S's by clicking the link in the show notes or by heading to offinthes's.com. Yes, the class was impressive at Daytona, specifically how they improved so much from this time last year. Now, of course, all these manufacturers were present on the IMSA grid last year, so of course, Stu, they're going to improve where they were last year. Last year, the Rolex was their first race ever under these new regulations. However, I think it's very clear everything that they've learned throughout the entirety of the first season, they're bringing back and applying to these cars, and that translated to some impressive lap times. I mean, let's look at these quali laps for a second. Compared to Acura's 2023 qualifying time, they were 9/10 of a second faster. BMW was 1.7 seconds faster than 2023, Cadillac 1.6 seconds faster, and Porsche improved 1.2 seconds over their qualifying time from last year. Now, it should be noted that the times that these cars were posting up in the race were very similar to where they were last year, with the air temps in this year's race being quite a bit warmer for the most part than they were last year's race, and thus leading to a little bit of a performance dip. I think it's safe to say that they did find quite a bit of time in this year's race as well. I think this is a trend that we can expect to see continue as the season goes on, especially as we head to almost all of these tracks for the second time. LMP2 has provided us some of the best and closest racing on the IMSA grid in recent years, but often it races in the shadow of the top class of prototypes and doesn't always get the attention it deserves. Recently, we've seen a surge in entries in IMSA's LMP2 class, in part because of the World Endurance Championship's decision to remove it from their full season championship, and as a result of IMSA removing its LMP3 class at the end of the 2023 season, and many of the teams in that class choosing to make the step up to LMP2. Now, LMP2 has a bronze driver mandate that requires there to be a gentleman driver on each one of the car's rosters. This is a great opportunity for these gentleman drivers to showcase their skills in a very quick prototype car, but it also provides us with some questionable mistakes that we see happening on track. I mean, the opening race of the season certainly witnessed its fair share of LMP2 incidents, and one car that just couldn't stay out of the spotlight, but it also showcased how incredible the racing in this class can be. We saw battles like in the closing hours of the race, the number 18 Era Motorsports car going toe-to-toe with the 04 CrowdStrike Racing entry. This is a battle that ultimately decided the race win, and while the carnage that the LMP3 class brought is somewhat behind us now, it does seem like some of those incidents may get brought up to LMP2 this year. Heading into Sebring though, I think it's safe to say that anything will be an improvement from some of the ridiculous LMP3 incidents that we witnessed here last year. Look, last year, Porsche had arguably the worst car on the grid during the Rolex 24. It was getting left in the dust on the straights, and although it won a couple of races last year, it was never consistently in the hunt for class wins. This year, the Porsche looked to be much more competitive. They had a great showing in the GTD PRO class, crossing in line second with Rexy, and importantly, they showed solid pace throughout the entire race. Whether last year's struggles could be attributed to GTP, just part shortage struggles, or maybe they just struggled to get a grip on the new car, 2024 looks to be a much better campaign coming up for the Porsche 911. It wasn't just Porsche that struggled at last year's Rolex 24 though, Lamborghini certainly had their struggles. They showed glimpses at various points of the season of how strong that car could be, but they just never really put it together in a race. This year they'll have 2 full season entries on the grid, with a car from Forte Racing and another entry from Wayne Taylor Racing that joins them. Now, like I said, when Lamborghini was on last year, they could be in contention for race wins. They looked quite strong. To start this season, they didn't look incredibly strong at the Rolex 24, but I think a second entry for them and a second time through the IMSA full season will only be good for them. And if I'm being honest, I think those two Lamborghini entries could be dark horse picks for the championship. Keep an eye on them as the season rolls on. Ah yes, and now we have Ferrari. Well, they looked incredible at the Rolex, and now we know why they looked virtually unbeatable in that race. However, putting everything that happened in that race aside and looking at the performance of the car, I think they showed a pretty big improvement from where they were last year. Yes, unfortunately, because they decided to go out and bend or just flat out break the rules, we don't really have a great gauge on exactly how well they're doing. And heck, we might not really ever know how strong they truly are if IMSA decides to go impose a BOP type penalty on them for the next race, that they're only also going to have one full season car on the grid for the rest of the IMSA championship. And many of those tracks is going to be the first time that the Ferrari's been to, so we're not really going to get a great gauge potentially of how strong the Ferrari is. But I do think that there's some improvements that they found in that car, coming off the backs of many of their other championships from last season. I'm not going to call for them to win the GTD championship. I think that's going to be a pretty steep uphill battle. However, I could see them being a very strong player in the Michelin Endurance Cup Series races for the rest of this year. Now, of course, yes, Ferrari has this huge question mark beside them as a result of the recent news coming out of them and BMW exceeding their performance windows that they were allotted for the Daytona race. There's a lot to unpack with that news, and I did my best to break it all down for you right here. Huge shout out to all of the channel supporters. If you too want to support the show, then you can head to patreon.com/offintheesses or hit that join button below. Once again, thanks for tuning in. I hope everyone has a great race weekend and doesn't go off in the S's.